All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, in that new disastrous Axios interview, President Trump sparked new fears about whether or not he will ultimately accept the results of the election in November by questioning once again the safety of vote-by-mail efforts. Let's take a listen.
We went through World War I, you went to the polls, you voted. We went through World War II, you went to the polls, you voted.
You've had mail-in voting since the Civil War.
And now, because of the China virus, we're supposed to stay home, send millions of ballots all over the country, millions and millions. You know, you could have a case where this election won't be decided on the evening of November 3rd.
Absolutely.
This election could
What's
be
wrong with that?
decided 2 months later.
It won't be 2 months, but what's wrong with the proper mailing
count? It could be decided many months later.
Now, my personal take, for what it's worth, is that Trump's authoritarian instincts are often checked by his general sloppy laziness. So, will he complain if he loses that it was unfair and rigged, et cetera, et cetera? Absolutely. Could that get nasty with his most diehard supporters and ugly civil unrest? Certainly possible. Will he actually provoke a constitutional crisis requiring Secret Service or the military to remove him from office? Not likely. I think he'll be happy to cry and moan on Newsmax or One American Network or wherever. But as with so many things regarding Trump, while he is a sort of master at finding the fault lines and fissures of our society and prying them apart, he's not actually the one who created those cracks. Much of the public, and certainly our elected leaders, like to pretend he and his ways just popped out of nowhere, out of the ether. But of course, that's not the case. If everything was all good to go with our democracy and its electoral institutions, then none of Trump's dumb, transparent mail-in ballot talk would be so legitimately concerning. I started asking myself the question this week. Okay, so Trump may well not accept the results of the election, but will Democrats? Based on the multi-year Russiagate obsession, the answer to this is pretty unclear at best. It's being charitable. They may not use the same uncouth and bold-faced tactics as Trump in denying electoral legitimacy, but it's hard to say that they ever really accepted the results in 2016. Even today, it is an entirely mainstream Democratic Party position to say that the press should not carry Trump's briefings, that he should be banned from social media, and the new addition that Biden should not debate him because he is an illegitimate president. But here's the thing. Yes, the Russiagate rejection of Trump was stupid, and to a certain extent, the Electoral College versus popular vote argument is as well, since everyone knew and agreed to those rules of the game. But it's not hard to imagine a situation where the results of the election really are truly illegitimate or at least questionable. You can certainly imagine Trump using whatever power he has to try to rig the game or at least muck up the waters enough to cause real doubt about the ultimate results. But you can also look to our real-time experiments with pandemic-era voting. Unfortunately, we might not want to admit it, but it's been kind of a disaster. In the earlier days, states pushed forward with mass in-person voting in spite of the rampaging virus. Polling places were closed, some were unmanned, poll workers contracted COVID, and turnout was dramatically down in the most effective voter suppression campaign that we have seen in modern times. Since states have ramped up mail-in balloting, hasn't gone all that much better. New York has been particularly problematic. Somewhere around 20% of mail-in ballots ended up being disqualified due to technicalities. It doesn't take a mathematician or independent election monitor to tell you that that is an outrageous and truly unconscionable percentage. 6 weeks later, winners have just been declared in two hard-fought Democratic primary congressional campaigns in the state. And in one of those, progressive Suraj Patel is trailing incumbent Carolyn Maloney by only 3,700 votes. Meanwhile, 13,000 mail-in ballots were tossed out due to errors like missing signatures or late postmarks. Patel and other candidates impacted by this disastrous election nightmare, they're not just sitting back and quietly accepting the results either. He has joined a lawsuit alleging that some of the discarded ballots were cast aside for reasons which voters had no control over. Contesting this result is not an affront to democracy, but rather an attempt to uphold it and accurately reflect the will of the people. We should also, though, take a moment to consider the granddaddy of all illegitimate elections. That would be Bush v. Gore. Now, you might not remember all of the nitty-gritty details, but here are the broad strokes. Florida, of course, was extremely close. There was a massive issue with ballot design that left a lot of intended Gore votes uncounted. George W. Bush's brother was helpfully governor of the state, and his Florida campaign co-chair, Katherine Harris, was Secretary of State. She certified the state for Bush. The Supreme Court halted a recount and essentially decided there wasn't enough time to determine a proper recount method, and George W. Bush became president of the United States. So basically, the courts ruled that it was more important to get the timeline correct than the will of the people correct. So that was cool. Al Gore did what civility politics demanded. He stepped aside.
While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession.
Now, this has been widely accepted and praised as the right and good thing to do for our democracy. But actually, it was a disaster. If you care about norms, institutions, and a functional democracy, 8 years of George W. Bush was a catastrophe. Torture, illegal surveillance, war crimes, mercenaries, outrageously brazen corruption, continued politicization of the courts, selling the country to Wall Street, and watching as it collapsed around us. I know people like to imagine George W. Bush now as some sweet old man, resistance-friendly dude, but it is hard to understate just how much of an absolute disaster those years were and the ways in which our country has been profoundly damaged, perhaps permanently, by the destruction which he wrought. Now, hindsight is 20/20, of course, but Al Gore should not have accepted the results of that election. It was legitimately illegitimate. And in the words of the modern-day resistance, George W. Bush was a unique threat to our constitutional republic. In fact, that stolen 2000 election and the gerrymandering and the Electoral College and the voter suppression and the intentionally engineered low participation rates and the undemocratic Senate, all of these things plant the seeds that blossom into a brazen Trump preemptively declaring that he may or may not accept the results of the election depending on his mood. It is an ugly place where we have landed, made uglier by an unchecked pandemic, which will almost certainly cause election night chaos and confusion, the likes of which perhaps we have never seen before. It is indeed an ugly place, but we should not bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it's otherwise. So while we should all be fighting for and hoping for the cleanest election possible with a fully functioning postal service, by the way, we should also be clear-eyed about this fact. Accepting an illegitimate outcome does not create democratic legitimacy. Just as in 2000, it ultimately destroys it. And Rachel, as I thought through this thing, here's one of the signature problems with Trump is whatever he says, Democrats immediately go you can't say that in any circumstances whatsoever. But there actually could be real questions about the legitimacy of this election, and pointing that out and challenging that is to uphold democracy, not to undermine it.
Yeah, one of the real things that puts a knot in my stomach about the next few months is this issue in particular, because we already tear ourselves apart about election legitimacy and who's the legitimate leader, will of the people, is their corrupt element, the deep state. So many conspiracy theories get thrown at this thing, and we are just opening a Pandora's box of that. If you look at mail-in voting, we as a country just aren't prepared for it, because it's a patchwork of laws. To your point about New York disqualifying all those ballots, that's New York state law that says, if it comes in, this is the state I grew up in, so I'm familiar with this, but if it comes in with Scotch tape, instead of sealing the envelope, it gets disqualified.
Wow.
If it comes in without a signature, it gets disqualified. But without a stamp, all these things prompt you to throw out a ballot. And there's tons of states like this. It's a patchwork quilt of laws. There's only 5 states that have functional, statewide mail-in voting. The rest of the states are just kind of at will. You have to request the ballot. They do it at a very small scale. We are scaling up a system that has a lot of problems.
Yeah, and here's the problem again with Trump is he has real concerns that he's going to lose. His real concerns are not with the sanctity of the elections. And so I understand the natural response to be this is really bad, what you're doing. And it is, right? You're undermining the legitimacy of the elections. You should not be saying these things. We have to trust that the election results are correct. And part of that sense around that goes back to that Bush v. Gore decision and the fact that Gore was seen as having done the correct thing by stepping aside, even though to this day that election, was basically deeply illegitimate and we never got an accurate count out of Florida. But the reality is that ended up doing so much damage to our democratic institutions. If you actually care about that, you have to be able to be honest about the potential problems that we are facing election night. And I just don't think that people have really grappled with this yet. We're still thinking in terms of election night. It's not even going to be that. First of all, voters are starting to vote here in the next month, sending in ballots, right? So the timeline on that front is completely different. And then the experiment governments that we've had in states so far, it has not been clean. It has not been pretty. And challenging those results are not an affront to democracy. They are helping to strengthen and make sure that the will of the people is actually heard. So I don't think Democrats should close themselves, should say, like, we can't say these things at all. They have to be honest about the potential challenges and problems that we could be facing come November.
Well, I think that's the question is, are we going to be able to ask those questions honestly? Because you have partisans in both camps that are willing to say, no outcome without, tremendous investigation.
Yeah.
And where does that end?
Right.
And people make money doing this.
Yeah.
And, I really think it's...
When you look at Russiagate,
exactly.
I mean, this was like, ridiculously invented conspiracy theory, always with the next shoe to drop.
Right.
And still is seen as, why he's an illegitimate president. And I'm not saying, like, the problem with Russiagate is there is a kernel of truth there of Russia trying to mess with our elections, but the idea that they're, a few $1 million on Facebook were what really sealed the deal for Trump is utterly absurd and ridiculous. And the ultimate thing that they believed would come out never comes out. So they've been bad actors in this regard, too.
Yeah. And when you sow those seeds within the electorate and people actually start to believe that they don't have a legitimate outcome in their elections, to your point, you start losing faith in all of your institutions. And when that happens, you don't have a functional representative government anymore. You don't have a functional democracy without that type of confidence that your vote counts, that what the outcome is true and honest. And that, I think, is much broader than just this election. That goes to the future of how we go forward as a country.
Yeah, and so when you exploit these legitimate questions in a partisan and disingenuous way, that further erodes the institutions of democracy and the faith that this is all like a good faith thing that we're all engaged in here.
But otherwise, everything's great.
Otherwise, it's all going good, guys. Next on Rising, economist Dean Baker explains why the coming relief bill is necessary for the literal survival of millions of Americans when Rising returns.